بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك أستغيث لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Today we'll be discussing Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In our previous conversation, we were looking at philosophy and the philosophy of history and how it connects historical knowledge with thought. Today, we'll be focusing on the philosophy of science and how historical knowledge plays a pivotal role when it comes to scientific development, its origins, its spread, and the changes and its influences. So, history, if viewed as a repository for more than anecdote or chronology, could produce a decisive transformation in the image of science by which we are now possessed. That image has previously been drawn, even by scientists themselves, mainly from the study of finished scientific achievements, as these are recorded in the classics, and more recently in the textbooks from which each new scientific generation learns to practice its trade. So essentially, science has been a result so far of studying finished scientific achievements, and this can be found in textbooks and also in other journals and other papers that a lot of scientists need to study to essentially practice and perfect their trade. I must add, Thomas Kuhn was writing this in the 20th century, in the 70s, and he was a professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT, which is very interesting, and he also wrote a lot when it came to quantum mechanics and physics. Inevitably, however, the aim of such books is persuasive and pedagogic. A concept of science drawn from them is no more likely to fit the enterprise that produced them than an image of a national culture drawn from a tourist brochure or a language text. So a very minimalist, minute perspective is essentially what he's trying to say here. This essay attempts to show that we have been misled by them in fundamental ways. Its aim is a sketch of the quite different concepts of science that can emerge from the historical record of the research activity itself. So here in this text, he is trying to show that we have been misled in fundamental and numerous ways, and he is trying to make us aware of this different concept of science that has emerged from historical record and research itself, rather than just a finished theory that's been put in front of you. So he's essentially taking various fragments of scientific knowledge and putting them together and introducing a unique paradigm. Even from history, however, that new concept will not be forthcoming if historical data continue to be sought and scrutinized mainly to answer questions posed by the unhistorical stereotype drawn from the science text. Those texts have, for example, often seemed to imply that the content of science is uniquely exemplified by the observations, laws, and theories described in their pages. Almost as regularly, the same books have been read as saying that scientific methods are simply the ones illustrated by the manipulative techniques used in gathering textbook data, together with the logical operations employed when relating those data to the textbook's theoretical generalizations. The result has been a concept of science with profound implication about its nature and development. So, various texts that we read are more or less looking at the implication of the content that's been put forward through various observation, laws, and theories. And what Kuhn is arguing is that this has resulted as a concept of science with profound implications. So he's questioning the nature and development of these observations of the nature and the laws that have been utilized to put forward a particular scientific text, and why scrutiny is imperative in this case. If, now this is a conditional sentence, if science is the constellation of facts, if science is a constellation of facts, theories, and methods collected in current texts, then scientists are the men who, successfully or not, have striven to contribute one or another element to that particular constellation. Scientific development becomes the piecemeal process by which these items have been added singly and in combination to the ever-growing stockpile that constitutes scientific technique and knowledge. And history of science becomes the discipline that chronicles both these successive increments and the obstacles that have inhibited their accumulation. So history's role in science is essentially understanding and putting forward chronicles, so in a historical manner, which depends upon time and the age, and understanding the successful increments of scientific thought and those disciplines. So how, for example, the allegory of the cave that Plato speaks about, we are still speaking about thousands of years. How has this increased in terms of entering into discussions, into films, into books, and so on, despite being thousands and thousands of years old? And the obstacles that have inhibited their accumulation. So what has caused certain accumulation of scientific discipline and scientific text to be stopped, to be disabled, essentially, as time went on? Concerned with scientific development, the historian then appears to have two main tasks. On the one hand, he must determine by what man and at what point in time each contemporary scientific fact, law, and theory was discovered or invented. So here he's essentially saying that we have to understand the person and the point in time in which that person was living, and the scientific facts, laws, and theories that were discovered, invented, and propagated and spread at that time. Whether they were false or whether they were true is what the historian and the philosopher of science has to embark on, this particular journey. And this is similar in Islam when it comes to a hadith. When we analyze a particular transmitter of a hadith, someone who has a biography, a profile of someone who is trustworthy, he went to the mosque 5 times and used to pray with Jama'at, in congregation. Was he a trustworthy person? Was he honest or dishonest? Did he meet people that were good or bad? Did he go to places that he shouldn't have been going to? Was he involved in certain businesses and certain enterprises that he should not have been involved in? Was he a spy? Was he a Muslim who became a non-Muslim, an apostate, and then became Muslim again? There's so many points to scrutinize and understand if this person is trustworthy or not. And same applies to females, particularly the wives of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is essentially what Kuhn is relaying, but in the context of science. On the other hand, he must, by he means the historian, on the other hand, he must describe and explain the congeries of error, myth and superstition that have inhibited the more rapid accumulation of the constituents of modern science text. Much research has been directed to these ends, and some still is. So at one point we have to understand the person involved, and on the other hand we have to understand the disorderly manner. Congeries means the disorderly manner of something being collected, and the error and the myths and superstitions that may have caused a particular scientific thought and scientific text to not be spread rapidly or even be accumulated, and even its constituents that exist in modern text. And much research has been directed to these ends, and some still is. So, for example, if we look at the scientific field of optics, Ibn al-Haytham did incredible work. And then fast forward, if we look at the study of light by, for example, Snell's law, which attempts to define and put forward the law, which is also known as Snell's law, of the angle of refraction, which is the angle of incidence once light enters a particular medium and then it bends. However, a few hundred years before Snell, Ibn Sahl put forward this idea. But why was, for example, Ibn Sahl's laws and theories and data and observations put to one side, but Snell was put forward? And how is it that parts of Ibn Sahl's discoveries of refraction and angle of incidence has entered into Snell's law and his work? Again, I'm not a mathematician or a historian of science, but what I'm trying to give an example here of is how some scientific observations, theories have entered into law, which were parts of other people before. This is why science is not the ownership of one particular religion or race or culture. It's universal. And in fact, science has allowed us to connect even closer with Allah. One last point here. Me personally, I became far more connected with Allah simply by studying neuroscience, the brain, the nervous system, and its constituents, and also genetics, and how something like the concept of SNPs, single nucleotide peptides, is so complicated, and something like, for example, the hippocampus, which is a cortical region in the medial to temporal lobes of the brain, are able to have such a crucial function. And if that hippocampus is damaged, the implications when it comes to memory and language and motor skills, navigation, so on and so forth. Subhanallah. Anyway, in recent years, however, a few historians of science have been finding it more and more difficult to fulfill the functions that the concept of development by accumulation assigns to them. So development of accumulation is becoming difficult. In the 70s, I guess it was. Now it's probably not so much. But then again, folks like the APA and the CDC and Big Pharma play a big role when it comes to biosciences and biomedical sciences. So how do we know that data is true? And there's many examples, even as of recent, of the inoculations and the scamdemic that occurred. As chroniclers of an incremental process, they discover that additional research makes it harder, not easier, to answer questions such as, when was oxygen discovered? Who first conceived of energy conservation? Increasingly, a few of them suspect that these are simply the wrong sorts of questions to ask. Perhaps science does not develop by the accumulation of individual discoveries and inventions. Similar to what I said earlier, it's not owned by a particular individual or a group, but it's multicultural, so to speak. Simultaneously, these same historians confront growing difficulties in distinguishing the scientific component of past observations and belief from what their predecessors had readily labeled error and superstition. So that's human nature at the end of the day, right? Anything from, let's say, the medieval period in Europe was considered blasphemy or witchcraft could have possibly been science. A famous example, not from this period, but from history, is the life of Galileo and how the Christian community at the time abused him, defamed him, and now we're talking about him. That's one of many examples that exist in history. So distinguishing that aspect of the scientific historical process, and also trying to understand how those theories, laws, and texts were able to sustain time and move forward with the times as well. Or should I say, actually sustain criticism and were able to move with time. The more carefully they study, let's say, Aristotelian dynamics, phlogistic chemistry, or caloric thermodynamics, the more certain they feel that those once current views of nature were, as a whole, neither less scientific nor more the product of human idiosyncrasies than those current today. Interesting. So what Kuhn is saying, that if, for example, we were to look at Aristotelian dynamics, phlogistic chemistry, and caloric thermodynamics, these are very niche specific areas of science that I'm not entirely familiar with. The more certain they feel that those once current views of nature were, as a whole, neither less scientific nor more the product of human idiosyncrasy than those current today. So these three various sciences Kuhn has mentioned are essentially idiosyncratic, meaning very unique to a particular person, and in this case, at that particular time. However, they seem to transcend time, as I mentioned, a few scientists and as Kuhn has pointed out too. So, if these out of date beliefs are to be called myths, then these myths can be produced by the same sort of methods and held for the same sort of reasons that now lead to scientific knowledge. I was just thinking of technology. So, for instance, something from the Middle Ages was considered a myth, was considered witchcraft, excuse me, considered magic. Using those same techniques today with the advancement of technology, because in those times what was considered advanced is now obsolete to a large degree or inferior, we can use those same methods to get those results and understand those theories and laws and interpret those texts. This will allow us to go towards that type of scientific knowledge, is what Kuhn is saying. If, on the other hand, they are to be called science, then science has included bodies of belief quite incompatible with the ones we hold today. So I made a couple of notes here actually on this particular point. Yeah, so in simpler terms, what Kuhn is saying is that the criterion and paradigms constantly shift. Kuhn says the latter is what the historian must choose. But the question is why? Why must we focus on science that has included possibly myths, possibly superstition, possibly witchcraft, possibly magic, right? Subjective to the definition back in those times, as well as subject to the current definition of science and scientific method. And due to this, it becomes difficult and also troublesome to view science as a developmental process that possesses the nature of gradual increase and growth by the addition of new layers and new parts and new perspective. In essence, accretion, right? So it's very difficult to say that, okay, this is definitely science. In other words, similar to Collingwood, if you remember, it's not watertight. It's loose and to a degree lucid, where anything can enter and mold science again. And that's why science is never ever definite. In fact, it's very difficult to be objective regarding science as it constantly changes. For example, gender theory. Gender theory is a new phenomenon, a very recent phenomenon. Whether you study the likes of Judith Butler or you look at the child abuse of Foucault, how they use discourse analysis to define gender and power and the social paradigms that exist. Now, that is considered a so-called science, but it's not actually a science. It's more of a philosophy, because what they are doing, the gender theorists and those philosophers and even psychologists who use discourse analysis, also known as DA, and this is a part of qualitative research. They use this in IPA therapy as well. What they are essentially doing is breaking down the meaning of what is being said and why individuals do particular actions, how they justify those particular actions, and the reason that they may be forced, influenced, or conform towards that particular action. A famous and well known study that is taught in this area is Why Women Smoke. It's a paper from the 90s, I believe, and it's a very postmodern esque paper, and it's taught in qualitative psychology. And the idea is to study and analyze why women begin smoking. And many of them say, well, I started doing this because of peer pressure, because I'm stressed out, because just wanted to let loose, just want to go out, take a break, so on and so forth. For those of you who've worked or run businesses and have employees, there are certain individuals that take numerous smoke breaks, not because they necessarily enjoy the nicotine, but it's more of a case of breaking free from the four rooms and the poor lighting. By poor lighting, I mean the white light that they sit under all day. So it's this idea that constantly changes the social landscape of how we analyze text and people. That in turn affects individuals who are looking to observe that particular theory and science, because 100 years ago, let's say in 1925, a teenager was not the same as the teenagers of today. In fact, there's a lot of footage where children used to clean chimneys in this country in the UK, and teenagers were out working in factories, and they would get married. They would marry very young, usually between the ages of 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. The average English family had more than one child, despite the poverty. And this poverty wasn't just living below an average income, but this was actual poverty where people were actually struggling really bad. George Orwell actually writes this in his book, The Peer to Wigan. It's regarding his journey up north to Wigan, near the Midlands, and observing how people were during that time in the early part to mid part of the 20th century. So we come to see that it's difficult, going back to the scientific aspect here, that given these alternatives, the historian must choose the latter, right? And the reason, and then I pose the question, why? Is it based on convenience? Is it based on the ease of analysis? Well, according to Kuhn, out-of-date theories are not in principle unscientific, because they have been discarded. That choice, however, makes it difficult to see scientific development as a process of accretion. The same historical research that displays the difficulties in isolating individual inventions and discoveries gives ground for profound doubts about the cumulative process through which these individual contributions to science were thought to have been compounded. So, an example of the issue of attributing an individual discovery or invention to a person and the problems it poses. An example of this is Nikola Tesla versus Thomas Edison. The result of all these doubts and difficulties is a historiographic revolution in the study of science, though one that is still in early stages. Gradually and often without entirely realizing they are doing so, historians of science have begun to ask new sorts of questions and to trace different and often less than cumulative developmental lines for the sciences. Rather than seeking permanent contributions of an older science to our present advantage, they attempt to display the historical integrity of that science in its own time. So instead of looking at an old theory from the point of view of modernity, they begin to analyze and break down that particular science in that time. Oh, look, Galileo, an example used here. The historians ask, for example, not about the relation of Galileo's views to those of modern science, but rather about the relationship between his views and those of his group, i.e., his teachers and contemporaries and immediate successors in the sciences. Furthermore, they insist upon studying the opinions of that group and other similar ones from that viewpoint, usually very different from that of modern science, that gives those opinions the maximum internal coherence and the closest possible fit to nature. So it's more or less a type of a political situation, really, right? Understanding how a scientist X in his time and how his relationship was with his contemporaries, his teachers, people who had contrasting views, his adversaries, and understanding the opinions of that group and similar viewpoints that they shared. So that is more of the focus rather than understanding contributions of older sciences from the present vantage. Now, we do see a shift at the moment, especially in the theological sphere. I'm talking about the online theological sphere. Fantastic work being done by Blogging Theology, Brother Paul Williams, Muhammad Hijab, and Subur Ahmed and Hamza Zostis, and many other brothers online who are questioning the history of, for example, the Trinity and early church characters, and also looking at the history of Isa alayhi salam and how in his time and few hundred years after, how views of Isa alayhi salam changed. So the Council of Nicaea, as we know, where one of the main things that was discussed and concluded that many of the earlier sects of Christianity were considered heretics and they were essentially kicked out of Christianity and Christendom, right? And Council of Nicaea, there were, I think, two of them, and I think this was the last one where this was done, and the idea of Trinity, and the Roman emperor at the time, Constantine, gave Isa al-Islam the characteristic, the attribution of divinity. A'udhu billah, astaghfirullah. And from that point till this very second, Protestants call Isa al-Islam Allah because of that, and Catholics believe he is the Son of God, although there are now contrasting views and there has been a huge paradigm shift. So my point here is that just like understanding science, same has been the case of understanding religion, where individual characters, their history must be studied, not in complete isolation, however. They must be applied from our modern vantage point, from our viewpoints in today's time. The beauty of the Quran, the last point I'll mention here, is the Quran fits perfectly with human nature, past, present, future. It fits perfectly with the characteristics of someone who is seeking knowledge or someone who is seeking to disprove the Quran. Either way, the Quran addresses every single one of those aspects. But the challenge that is posed, especially in today's time, as compared to when Kuhn was writing, or when Collingwood was writing, or when the Sahaba were alive, and all of the period from the moment the last companion passed away, Ibn Tufail, all the way to the second. The problem is that the level of intellect has dropped drastically of individuals. Now, I'm not talking about IQ. IQ is a scam, complete scam. And we see many personalities discuss it. For example, Brother Sahil Adim talks about IQ. And the problem with IQ is the way it's measured and the biases that exist and the way the individual Hans Eisnig was actually a racist. Of course, he was a Jew who put forward ideas that how American Jews are superior and how whites and Chinese are also superior and how the African American is essentially not as so-called intellectually superior. But the problem here is that the definition of superior intellect is not only quantifiable. There has to be a qualitative aspect of it. For example, just because you read 15 books on Christianity does not mean you are able to put forward the philosophy of Christianity. I don't consider it religion. The philosophy of Christianity as the truth with a capital T. You have to qualify it from a quantitative and a qualitative point of view as well. So the fact that so many gospels have been proven to be not the actual gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Again, we don't even know who these individuals are. Philo of Alexandria is usually associated with the character of St. Paul in terms of the writings of St. Paul. Look, at the end of the day, there's a lot of wisdom one can take from folks like St. Paul and St. Anselm and all these other folks. The point is that at the end of the day, what is the relationship of ensuring that human nature fits perfectly and there is coherence of that era of human being and today's human being? So the Quran and of course by extension the hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam remain true. Okay, and it's our job as Muslims to step into the territory of our enemies, step into the territory of those people who try and belittle the Quran, who try and who try and smear the name of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions and everyone else. So before we can even do that, we have to perfect our own knowledge of our own book. I myself still on that journey, but I can to a very large degree discriminate in terms of the truth with the small t and the truth with the big T. That's all it is at the end of the day. Seen through the works that result, works perhaps best exemplified in the writings of Alexander Koyer. Science does not seem altogether the same enterprise as the one discussed by writers in the older historiographic tradition. By implication, at least these historical studies suggest the possibility of a new image of science. This essay aims to delineate that image by making explicit some of the new historiography's implications. Historiographies should be historiographical implications. Anyway, what aspects of science will emerge to prominence in the course of this effect? First, at least in order of presentation, is the insufficiency of methodological directives by themselves to dictate a unique substantive conclusion to many sorts of scientific questions. Methodological directives, a framework which you can use and directs you on the course of understanding the conclusions that you are trying to reach. So if I'm trying to reach conclusion X and I reach towards conclusion X, that is because of the framework I was able to use. But maybe that framework was insufficient, though I reached my conclusion. Or maybe the framework is sufficient, but instead of reaching conclusion X, I reach conclusion Y. So the idea is that how can we ensure that such a process is robust, is what Kuhn is trying to say. And I believe here that there are many different scientific questions that are unanswered because of this, and this is why science can never ever be completely watertight, completely true with a capital T, because this is human beings at play trying to discover and uncover the world that Allah created, from the earliest cell to the earliest seed, all the way to the human being that was just brought into this world. Allahu Akbar al-Kabir. Instructed to examine electrical or chemical phenomena, the man who is ignorant of these fields but who knows what it is to be scientific may legitimately reach any one of a number of incompatible conclusions. Among those legitimate possibilities, the particular conclusions he does arrive at are probably determined by his prior experience in other fields, by the accidents of his investigation, and by his own individual makeup. So this is similar to what I mentioned earlier, is the legitimate possibilities and the particular conclusions he does arrive at are probably determined by prior experience in other fields. So for example, there is an emerging field, there are many emerging fields, but one of the emerging fields in neuroscience in over the past 2 to 3 decades is neurocardiology, and this is the study of neurons that exist around the heart. This was a paper and discovery done about 2 or so decades ago, where 40 to 50,000 neurons were found around the human heart. Previously, it was not believed that neurons existed around the heart, and this is why the Quran, for example, constantly speaks of the heart, the heart, the heart, the heart, the heart. It's the heart that is blind, not the eyes, for example. When it comes to emotion, when it comes to pain, when it comes to deceit, when it comes to cheating, when it comes to any evil or good energy, the heart plays the main role. It's central towards our intentions, our motivations, our thoughts, right? And this is very fascinating what Kuhn mentions, which is still applicable today, because prior experience in other fields helps and aids someone when they're looking to pursue something else. For example, my background is in psychology and neuroscience, right? When I study philosophy, when I study history, when I study politics, when I study anthropology and genetics and anything else, even the Quran, for instance, and the hadith, I use Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, right? So, as I was speaking about, prior experience in other fields is very, very important. By the accidents of his investigation and by his own individual makeup. So, for example, penicillin was discovered accidentally, and then you have many other aspects where certain scientific fields depend upon a unique approach to research. For example, there was an African American lady her name was Henrietta Lacks. Excuse me. And Henrietta Lacks was a lady whose DNA found the cure for one of the cancers. I don't remember which one. And to this day, her DNA is being studied and researched upon when it comes to curing this specific type of cancer. And her family have not received a single penny of compensation, or at least given the recognition. There have been biographies written about her by Rebecca Scoot, I believe, and it's quite sad. So this corruption also exists. We mustn't forget. It's not simply a case of innocently researching, looking at data and theories, and you put it forward and it's published, and your name is out there. It's literally a case of where there are certain lobbies and certain conversations and certain people you have to sit down with and be around and socialize with. And Jeffrey Epstein is why I would say you can research into how his relationship with Richard Dawkins, Dan Dennett, and many other so-called scientists were able to publish and put forward their stuff and became extremely popular. Steven Pinker being another one of those folks. And let's not forget Robert Maxwell, who purchased one of the biggest publication houses of scientific journals, Elsevier. So, looking at all of this, science is a scam to a large degree, and the fact that it can be bought and lobbied questions a lot of science that exists around us. And if we take a step back in history, using everything we've learned so far together, something like Darwinism is also a scam. The way Huxley pushed that concept forward, the way eugenics came into play because of Darwinian evolution and superiority of race and medical experiments that were done on children and so-called savages who were the ethnicities that weren't white or of the Aryan race, and how a specific political group from Germany during World War II utilized this particular idea as well. So really and truly, science is not what it poses to be. There are many more layers that have to be peeled off to really understand. And it's quite sad that all fields of science have been infiltrated, and it's only a matter of time once each of these fields are exposed by the child abusers and the PDF files that lobby and fund them. And of course, it's every single time it's those people. What beliefs about the stars, for example, does he bring to the study of chemistry or electricity? Which of the many conceivable experiments relevant to the new field does he elect to perform first? And what aspects of the complex phenomena that then results strike him as particularly relevant to an elucidation of the nature of chemical change or of electrical affinity? So, believing in stars, how would such a belief allow an individual to understand complex phenomena and the results that can be derived or at least driven towards the nature of chemical change or of electrical affinity, the obsession, you could say, or the liking of electricity? How does belief in the stars do that? Well, look, Muslim scientists studied the sky, the stars, and played a massive role in astronomy and optics and medicine because of the Quran and the tradition that came from their own, again, culture and the people around them. You can look at the times of Ibn Sina, who was also known as Avicenna. You can look at Ibn Haytham, Ibn Sahel, and the Musa brothers, and how they were able to play such a pivotal role during Islam's golden age, and how the Abbasid period was the center, the epicenter of all scientific knowledge, and how in Baghdad the House of Wisdom, Baytul Hikmah, was established, and Muslims, non-Muslims alike, were part of that culture. And evidence of that is Thabit ibn Qurra. He was a Sabitian, and the Sabitian were people who worshipped the stars, and they were very much similar to, their religion was very similar to, if I'm not mistaken, Zoroastrianism and paganism. But despite that, he was able to excel, and he wasn't, burned at the stake, so to speak. So it's this idea that just because you have a belief in Allah, you can't progress in science. In fact, without the belief in Allah, you can't progress in anything. Forget science. For the individual, at least, and sometimes for the scientific community as well, answers to questions like these are often essential determinants of scientific development. We shall note, for example, in section 2, that the early developmental stages of most sciences have been characterized by continual competition between a number of distinct views of nature each partially derived from and or roughly compatible with the dictates of scientific observation and method. What differentiated these various schools was not one or another failure of method, they were all scientific, but what we shall come to call their incommensurable ways of seeing the world and of practicing science in it. So, understanding not the failure of their methods that was considered science at the time, but understanding the ways that do not comply or are not acceptable in today's paradigm and definition of science. Observation and experience can and must drastically restrict the range of admissible scientific belief. Else there could be no science, but they cannot alone determine a particular body of such belief. An apparently arbitrary element compounded of personal and historical accident is always a formative ingredient of the beliefs espoused by a given scientific community at a given time. So now here, Kuhn is taking a kind of a big leap here. And I say a kind of a big leap because two things are happening in this particular paragraph. Number one, Kuhn says observation and experience can and must drastically restrict the range of admissible scientific belief, else there will be no science. So Ibn Haytham, who's considered the father of the scientific method, the modern scientific method where observation and experimentation play an integral role and form the basis of your theory. Of course, starts with hypothesis, observation, experiments, then you have your theory, and then after that it's tested, goes through a falsification process, understanding errors, any variables that might be way far on the graph, maybe it's skewed positively or negatively within subjects, between subjects, t-tests, chi-square tests, so on and so forth. So it's not a case where all observations and experience can simply enter into science and be called science. That's number one. Number two is that, which seems apparently arbitrary, but I would argue it's not arbitrary. What am I talking about? Is the compounded personal and historical compounded of personal is always a so the beliefs that were espoused by an individual and therefore the group and the community is not something to be taken lightly. That plays a big part, has a huge influence on how scientific knowledge, theory and observations are made. For example, a few years ago you would have been considered an anti-vax individual because of the type of studies and the type of so-called science that was being put forward. Probably remember the phrase that was being thrown around a few years ago: trust the science, trust the science, trust the science. One of the worst human beings to walk this earth, Anthony Fauci, said, I am science. So he, in and of itself, called himself the ultimate authority over everyone else in that particular realm. And the fact that it was pushed aggressively, aggressive measures were taken, everyone was locked in their house, everyone was forced to be stabbed with this particular poison, and it affected the livelihoods, and even to this very second many people have not recovered. And that just goes to show how scientific supremacy, as I will call it, scientific supremacy reigns supreme. At the end of the day, takes the upper hand. It doesn't matter how much philosophy of science we read, that's the reality we live in now. And not just now, it's always been the case for a very long time. There have been many child experiments during the Cold War in America, for example. One example I'll give here just before we move forward is Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk was considered the so-called pioneer of the polio vaccine, and the fact that experiments were done on what was classified as retarded children, mentally, physically challenged individuals without the knowledge of the parents, and the fact that they were literally used as guinea pigs, used as animals for experiments less than 100 years ago. And the CIA, of course, played a huge role in this. And I will never kill myself or harm anyone or any animal. That element of arbitrariness does not, however, indicate that any specific group could practice its trade without some set of received beliefs, nor does it make it less consequential the particular constellation to which the group at a given time is in fact committed. Effective research scarcely begins before a scientific community thinks it has acquired firm answers to two questions like the following. What are the fundamental entities of which the universe is composed? So what are the fundamental particles, materials that the universe is composed of? How do these interact with each other and with the senses? What questions may legitimately be asked about such entities, and what techniques employed is in seeking solutions? At least in the mature sciences, answers to questions like these are firmly embedded in the educational initiation that prepares and licenses the student for professional practice. So these are mature sciences where the answers are, where trying to get answers to questions like these lies in the pursuit of this trade. Without the pursuit of answers, it's very difficult to work on a question. This is common sense. But that education is both rigorous and rigid. These answers come to exert a deep hold on the scientific mind. That they can do so does much. That they can do so, that's a typo. They can do so much to account both for the peculiar efficiency of the normal research activity and for the direction in which it proceeds at any given time. When examining normal sciences in section 3, 4, and 5, we shall want finally to describe that research as a strenuous and devoted attempt to force nature into the conceptual boxes supplied by professional education. So this is very profound. What Kuhn is saying is that we are trying to force nature into the boxes we've created as a scientific community. We are trying to force the Quran into our own social landscape we have boxed. For example, the marriage of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to Aisha salamullah alayha, where she was married at the age of 6 according to the Sahih Hadith, and marriage was consummated at 9. We're trying to now say, by we I mean other individuals who are trying to conform to the liberal world order, that she was a teenager and trying to force this paradigm of, hey, us Muslims and Islam and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his contemporaries at the time do fit into today's model. I don't care about today's science. Personally, I don't care about today's social landscape. Anything that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, anything he did was not false, was not dishonest, was not fabricated. There is enough Sahih Hadith to illustrate this. In fact, there is Sahih Hadith where Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "From this tongue nothing but the truth comes out." And also another Sahih Hadith where Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, I'm paraphrasing here, where he states that my words are brief but the meanings are very deep. And that is the case, right? For example, we see a verse in the Quran where a man is allowed to beat his wife, not to beat her black and blue and break her bones and MMA style just completely put her in a chokehold and change her face, so to speak. But it's a case where light tap and you can hit her with a stick, like a miswak stick or like a pencil, like kind of like this, just to give you an illustration. And really and truly, a Muslim man with a capital M, capital Muslim, capital M man, You don't really need to beat your wife. You just use your words and please her in all ways. Of course, there are challenges where you will come across situations where your wife is not satisfied with you. You will have disagreements with your mum, your daughters, and so on and so forth. That's just the nature of woman. Okay, you just have to be a man and just deal with it in the best way possible. Try and control your temper and try and ensure that you're not trying to fit her in your own box. Just like what Kuhn mentioned here, we're trying to fit nature in our scientific box that we've created, right? People often complain that, oh, well, if the Quran said something about science 1400 odd years ago, why is it being proven now by a non-Muslim? Well, three things. Number one, that's the failure of Muslims in and of themselves. Once they left true Islam and adopted other mystical aspects of life, such as Sufism, which is a complete scam. At that point, science was no longer the way it was observed, practiced, written, and absorbed by the Muslim minds and souls at the time. Many people attribute Al-Ghazali, Al-Ghazal as is known, to be the forerunner of, hey, get rid of science, focus on religion. I disagree with that, despite many odd things he has written about. You have to give credit where credit is due at the end of the day. So it's essential that we understand the route that has led us to this way, is my whole point of giving these examples and reading this and telling you how and why and when such conclusions have been drawn. We are facing an info war, literally an information war. It's an intellectual war where we will have to play a part and do our best in playing that part, right? So at the end of the day, my goal is to break down all these texts in a succinct and brief manner, although my goal primarily is to explain in depth as much as I can, not to just read it and just make a few comments from my own limited mind that exists, right? Knowledge is scarce, information is abundant. So now I'm just going to read a few pages of section 2 of Kuhn's essay, and inshallah we'll see what we can take from what he has to say. In this essay, normal science means research firmly based upon one or more past scientific achievements that some particular scientific community acknowledges for a time as supplying the foundations for its further practice. Today, such achievements are recounted, though seldom in their original form, by science textbooks, elementary and advanced. And these textbooks expound the body of accepted theory, illustrate many or all of its successful applications, and compare these applications with exemplary observations and experiments. Before such books became popular early in the 19th century, many of the famous classics of science fulfilled a similar function. For example, Aristotle's Physica, Ptolemy's Almagest, Newton's Principia and Optics, Franklin's Electricity, Lavoisier's Chemistry, and Lyell's Geology. These and many other works served for a time implicitly to define the legitimate problems and methods of a research field for succeeding generations of practitioners. They were able to do so because they shared two essential characteristics. Their achievement was sufficiently unprecedented to attract an enduring group of adherents away from competing modes of scientific activity. Simultaneously, it was sufficiently open-ended to leave all sorts of problems for the redefined group of practitioners to resolve. So Kuhn is saying that normal science, what he means by normal science is research based upon one or more, so depending upon, in a sense, past scientific achievements that some particular scientific community acknowledges for a time, as supplying the foundations for its further practice. For example, a lot of the Muslim contributions in science when it came to physics and astronomy were reliant upon Euclidean geometry and Ptolemy's work and Aristotelian logic. So normal science at that time is now outdated science in today's time in classical works that Kuhn mentions here. And they were able to do so because they shared two essential characteristics. Their achievement was sufficiently unprecedented to attract an enduring group, of adherents away from competing modes of scientific activity. So, in a sense, he's saying that they attracted the competition, which is, if you can attract the competition, that is one of the best skills, arguably the best skill. Simultaneously, it was sufficiently open-ended to leave all sorts of problems for the redefined group of practitioners to resolve. So there were open-ended issues that existed eventually, and then the new redefined practitioners, the individuals who were studying science under the new paradigms, the new definitions and the laws and the text, they were now responsible for solving problems that would later be resolved eventually and lead to newer definitions. So science, as Kuhn mentioned earlier, it's an incremental process. It's a combination of many theories. But then again, the problem is posed from a historical and a philosophical point of view. Achievements that share these two characteristics I shall henceforth refer to as paradigms. A term that relates closely to normal science. By choosing it, I mean to suggest that some accepted examples of scientific practice, examples which include law, theory, application, and instrumentation together, provide models from which spring particular coherent traditions of scientific research. So, from a neuroscience point of view, we have various neuroscientific methods and instruments we use to now analyze, for example, developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. One area is neuroconstructivism, which is a framework that looks at analyzing from a single cell all the way up to the development of the child, including adulthood as well, how neural processes, the underpinning neural processes, work in unison to a degree with the substrate that exists on these neural processes that allow us to understand behaviors and changes in behaviors, and how this diversity that happens from the moment you learn to speak all the way up to adulthood, right? And how it can be constructed simply based on these neural underpinnings. Again, that poses a lot of problems. And apart from neuroconstructivism, you have neurophilosophy. Neurophilosophy attempts to use the philosophical understanding of science, right, similar to what we're reading now, but in the context of the field of neuroscience, right? And the idea here is that if, for example, a particular instrument, let's say by GE, one of the biggest companies that create these super advanced, extremely incredible machines that allow us to do ultrasound studies on women's wombs to understand how children actually react to dots and how they can move their face when they move their face in real time in the womb. This is a scientific study that was done in the 90s by a scientist from the UK, and they continue to do this study in a more advanced manner, i.e., shift in paradigms, because of the instruments and the applications and the process and the theories and the laws. In 2017, they showed that 3 dots in different directions on the mother's womb makes the fetus move its head, and this moving of the head is proof that how a face a light that is shaped as a face is to a degree evidence how babies are able to observe changes in the environment. And neuroconstructivism takes into account genetics and environment interaction and genetics and environment correlation. These are 2 different things which I'm not going to go into at the moment, but in simpler terms, it's very hard to study genetics on its own in isolation. An environment is needed where such genes are turned on, so to speak. So this is what Kuhn is saying, and the examples he gives are the following. These are the traditions which the historian describes under such rubrics as Ptolemaic astronomy or Copernican, Aristotelian dynamics or Newtonian, corpuscular optics or wave optics, and so on. Quantum biology is a new field of science, looking at biology from a quantum mechanics point of view. Quantum tunneling and the concept of how smell is able to change the direction in which fruit flies fly, and how the navigation of birds occur because of a built-in GPS system that only quantum physics can at least touch the surface and give us some, not entirely, but some understanding. So, quite amazing. The study of paradigms, including many that are more specialized than those named above, illustratively above, is what mainly prepares the student for membership in the particular scientific community with which he will later practice. Again, if you're going to study psychology, you have to go through the Foucault nonsense of discourse analysis and a lot of other Darwinian evolution processes you have to learn and take on board, especially if you're studying the neuroscience of perception, attention, and vision. Because he there joins men who learned the basis of their field from the same concrete models, his subsequent practice will seldom evoke overt disagreements over fundamentals. Because he there joins men who learn the basis of their field from the same concrete models, so the man who's entered this field is more or less thinking along the same lines of the other men in his group. His subsequent practice, what he will do in the future, will seldom evoke, will rarely cause overt, in the open, disagreements over fundamentals. So it's very rare that there will be disagreements in this particular type of scientific group, because they've been trained in that way in the first place, i.e. vaccines. Men whose research is based on shared paradigms are committed to the same rules and standards for scientific practice. Same thing is observed in Islam to a very, 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 very large degree. That commitment and the apparent consensus it produces are prerequisites for normal science, in essence, for the genesis and continuation of a particular research tradition. This is what Kuhn is saying And I can give an example of ijma, where ijma is consensus where scholars agree on a particular issue X. And there's agreement that yes, this has to be done, this has to be considered, this has to be played out for situation X to be true or untrue or halal or haram and so on and so forth. And so this commitment is the prerequisite for normal science, as he mentions. And this is the origin and the continuation of a particular research tradition. And the examples again are Darwinism, now neo-Darwinism, big pharma, politically lobbied scientists. Example I can give you of Sidney Gottlieb and his experiments on humans, whilst at the CIA. Of course, yes, he is one of those juices. Because in this essay, the concept of a paradigm will often substitute for a variety of familiar notions. More will need to be said about the reasons for its introduction. Why is the concrete scientific achievement as a locus of professional commitment prior to the various concepts, laws, theories, and points of view that may be abstracted from it? That's not a coherent sentence. Why is the concrete scientific achievement as a locus for professional commitment prior to the various concepts, laws, theories, and points of view that may be abstracted from it? Because paradigm often substitute for a variety of familiar notions, more will need to be said about reasons. Right. In what sense is the shared paradigm a fundamental unit for the student of scientific development? Dogma, in other words. A unit that cannot be fully reduced to logically atomic components which might function in its stead. When we encounter them in section 5, answers to these questions and others like them will prove basic to an understanding both of normal science and of the associated concept of paradigms. That more abstract discussions will depend, however, upon a previous exposure to examples of normal science or of paradigms in operation. In particular, both these related concepts will be clarified by noting that there can be a sort of scientific research about paradigms, or at least without any so unequivocal and so binding are the ones named above. Acquisition of paradigms and of the more esoteric type of research it permits is acquisition of a paradigm and of the more esoteric type of research it permits is a sign of maturity in the development of any given scientific field. Okay. So what he's saying is that there are related concepts that can be clarified without any specific paradigm. How? Well, this is something we will have to come across later in this book. Acquisition of a paradigm and of the more esoteric type of research it permits is a sign of maturity and development of any given scientific field. Okay, if the historian traces the knowledge of any selected group of related phenomena backward in time, he is likely to encounter some minor variant of pattern. Here illustrated from the history of physical optics. Today's physics textbooks tell student that light is photons. Light is photons, i.e. quantum mechanical entities that exhibit some characteristics of waves and some of particles. Yeah, that's what quantum biology speaks about when explaining photosynthesis, that light is a photon, which can be a wave or a particle. So there's different paradigms, and this is where one can absorb the other, is what Kuhn is saying. Research proceeds accordingly, or rather according to the more elaborate and mathematical categorization from which this usual verbalization is derived. That characterization of light is, however, scarcely half a century old. Before it was developed by Planck, Einstein, and others early in this century, physics texts taught that light was transverse wave motion, a conception rooted in a paradigm that derived ultimately from optical writings of Young and Fresnel in the early 19th century, nor was the wave theory the first to be embraced by almost all practitioners of optical science. During the 18th century, the paradigm for this field was provided by Newton's optics, which taught that light was material corpuscles, and at that time physicists sought evidence, as the early wave theorists had not, of the pressure exerted by light particles impinging on solid bodies. An example I can give this is an early Greek scientific thought. It was believed that man's sperm actually had another man inside it. And another thing was there is, which actually Dan Dennett speaks about as well, interestingly, that there is a theater in your brain when you're observing something, and that observation is an observation of an observer. So an observation you're having right now of me, there's a theater in your brain, and that is being observed by another observer. Absurd, really. But Dan Dennett, again, what do you expect from materialists? Joseph Priestley, History and the Present State of Discoveries Relating to Vision. This is the book, Vision, Light and Colors. This is the book that is quoted here by Kuhn regarding the concepts he's speaking about. You can see it here. For those of you interested, you can check it out. These transformations of the paradigms of physical optics are scientific revolutions, and the successive transition from one paradigm to another via revolution is the usual developmental pattern of mature science. Okay. It is not, however, the pattern characteristics of the period before Newton's work, and that is the contrast that concerns us here. No period between remote antiquity and the end of the 17th century exhibited a single generally accepted view about the nature of light. Instead, there were a number of competing schools and sub-schools, most of them espousing one variant or another of Epicurean, Aristotelian, or Platonic theory. That's true. One group took light to be particles emanating from material bodies. For another, it was a modification of the medium that intervened between the body and the eye. Still another explained light in terms of an interaction of the medium with an emanation from the eye. And there were other combinations and modifications besides. So there were schools of thought that believed light was coming out of your own eye when observing the environment. Many believe that what you are even observing is not really true. It's something that's led to severe skepticism as well. Nowadays you have simulation theory. Back then you had a different thought in Greek philosophy. So each of the corresponding schools derived strength from its relation to some particular metaphysic, and each emphasized as paradigmatic observations. Paradigmatic, I believe, means two opposing views that are contrasting each other. Paradigmatic, serving as a typical example of something. Adjective, serving as a typical example of something, of or denoting the relationship between a set of linguistic items that form mutually exclusive choices in particular syntactic roles. Paradigmatic means typical example of something. Okay, perfect. Brilliant. Emphasize the particular cluster of optical phenomena that its own theory could do most to explain. So it was a typical example, again, relative to the moment and time it existed in. Other observations were dealt with by ad hoc elaborations, or they remained as outstanding problems for further research. And this is a French book that is being quoted here, Histoire de la Lumière by Vasco Ronchi, translated by Jean Taton. Never heard of either of them. I guess a quick look at this. At various times, all these schools made significant contributions to the body of concepts, phenomena, and techniques from which Newton drew the first nearly uniformly acceptable paradigm for physical optics. Any definition of the scientist that excludes at least the more creative members of these various schools will exclude their modern successors as well. That's true. You can't dismiss an old science because it sounds too fantastical or too mythical. Dismissing that means you will dismiss one of the modern members of science because their findings, laws, and what they were trained upon lies on much of that research as well and thoughts. Those men were scientists, yet anyone examining a survey of physical optics before Newton may conclude that though the field's practitioners were scientists, the net result of their activity was nothing less than science. Being able to take no common body of belief for granted, each writer on physical optics felt forced to build his field anew from its foundations. In doing so, his choice of supporting observation and experiment was relatively free, for there was no standard set of methods or of phenomena that every optical writer felt forced to employ and explain. So it's very fluid when one of the scientists who come up with a new paradigm can pick out previous existing ones and able to employ them. And at the time there weren't any set standards or set of methods. Under these circumstances, the dialogue of the resulting books was often directed as much to the members of other schools as it was to nature. That pattern is not unfamiliar in a number of creative fields today, nor is it incompatible with significant discovery and invention. It is not, however, the pattern of development that physical optics acquired after Newton and that other natural sciences make familiar today. The history of electrical research in the first half of the 18th century provides a more concrete and better known example of the way a science develops before it acquires its first universally received paradigm. During that period, there were almost as many views about the nature of electricity as there were important electrical experiments. Men like Hawksby, Gray, Desogliers, Dufay, Nollet, Watson, Franklin, and others. All their numerous concepts of electricity had something in common. They were partially derived from one or another version of the mechanical corpuscular philosophy that guided all scientific research of the day. In addition, all were components of real scientific theories, of theories that had been drawn in part from experiment and observation, and that partially determined the choice and interpretation of additional problems undertaken in research. Yet, though all the experiments were electrical, and though most of the experimenters read each other's works, their theories had no more than a family resemblance. So even though each of them understood and borrowed, and it seems to be a case where they relied upon each other's observations and research, despite some time differences, there seems to be a close relation, a resemblance of a family, Kuhn says here. And we certainly do see that in neuroscience, we see that in many other sciences as well. So, what we can say so far is that science is more or less an ancestry progression. And that makes sense to a degree. And the references given here are quite few by Kuhn. The development of the concept of electric charge, electricity from the Greeks to Coulomb, and this is by Duane Roller, author with the same name. Okay, interesting. And Franklin and Newton, an inquiry into speculative Newtonian experimental science, and Franklin's work in electricity as an example thereof. And as I mentioned here, Kuhn also speaks about the function of dogma in scientific research. Remember I mentioned this earlier? I just realized that he has a paper, subhanAllah, that he published in 1961. Pending more precise. Okay, so that's a paper I must read. Just double checking here when this particular book came out, because this is 1961. Right, I do apologize. This book was actually written in 1962, and he wrote this paper, Functional Dogma and Scientific Research, in 1961. So this was a concept being discussed anyway at the time, shortly after World War II. Also, we have to take into account World War II. A lot of paradigms had changed when it came to science and engineering and discovery and medicine and politics as well, and money. One early group of theories following the 17th century practice regarded attraction and frictional generation as a fundamental concept of electrical phenomena. This group tended to treat repulsion as a secondary effect due to some sort of mechanical rebounding, and also to postpone for as long as possible both discussion and systematic research on Gray's newly discovered effect, electrical conduction. Other electricians, the term is their own, took attraction and repulsion to be equally elementary manifestations of electricity, and modified their theories and research accordingly. Actually, this group is remarkably small. Even Franklin's theory never quite accounted for the mutual repulsion of two negatively charged bodies. But they had as much difficulty as the first group in accounting simultaneously for any but the simplest conduction effects. Those effects, however, provided the starting point for still a third group, which tended to speak of electricity as a fluid that could run through conductors rather than as effluvium that emanated from non-conductors. This group in its turn had difficulty reconciling its theory with the number of attractive and repulsive effects. Interesting. Okay, so now he's given a breakdown of history of electricity. So I'm just going to read a little bit more here before we return back to Kuhn. And I think so far it's fair to say that science will always be changing at this point. Only through the work of Franklin and his immediate successors did a theory arise that we could account with something like equal facility for very nearly all the effects that that therefore could and did provide a subsequent generation of electricians with a common paradigm for its research, excluding those fields like mathematics and astronomy in which the first firm paradigms date from prehistory, and also those like biochemistry that arose by division and recombination of specialities already matured. The situation the situations outlined above are historically typical, though it involves my continuing to employ the unfortunate simplification that tags an extended historical episode with a single and somewhat arbitrarily chosen name. Example given Newton or Franklin. I suggest that similar fundamental disagreements categorized, for example, the study of motion before Aristotle and of statics before Archimedes, the study of heat before Black, of chemistry before Boyle and Boerhaave, and of historical geology before Hutton. What's fascinating, he lists all these folks, but he didn't mention a single Muslim. Jabir ibn Hayyan was fundamental in the school of chemistry. Imam Jafar, who's considered one of the founders of chemistry, in fact, the periodic table was initially compiled by a Muslim chemist. The word alchemy comes from Arabic. And another fascinating thing actually here is that the chapter in the Quran which talks about iron, which I believe is chapter number 56. Sorry, no, 57. Chapter number 57 is one of the numbers of the isotype of iron. Hadid is iron in Arabic. If you look at Fe on the periodic table, so there seems to be some bias of thought when he's writing this, but so far I don't entirely disagree with Kuhn, because much of the scrutiny involved in the philosophy of science and historical knowledge in relation to the philosophy of science, similar to how we view Islamic history and the tafsir, the exegesis, and the understanding of hadith. So I don't so far disagree. In parts of biology, the study of heredity, for example, the first universally received paradigms are still more recent, and it remains an open question what parts of social science have yet acquired such paradigms at all. History suggests that the road to a firm research consensus is extraordinarily arduous. Arduous means something that is difficult and hard. For example, a journey or a process or climbing. You can say, okay, this journey is arduous. My time spent working out in the mountains was arduous, so on and so forth. History also suggests, however, some reasons for the difficulties encountered on that road. In the absence of a paradigm or some candidate for paradigm, all of the facts that could possibly pertain to the development of a given science are likely to seem equally relevant. As a result, early fact gathering is a far more nearly random activity than the one that subsequent scientific development makes familiar. Furthermore, in the absence of a reason for seeking some particular form of more recondite information, early fact gathering is usually restricted to the wealth of data that lie ready to hand. The resulting pool of facts contains those accessible to casual observation and experiment, together with some of the more esoteric data retrievable from established crafts like medicine, calendar making, and metallurgy. Recondite means obscure, deep, profound, complex, difficult. Because the crafts are one readily accessible sources of facts that could not have been casually discovered, technology has played a vital role in the emergence of new sciences. We'll leave it here for now. Inshallah, we shall return to Kuhn and his idea of paradigm shifts. In conclusion, what I will say is that science is ever changing, paradigms will change, human beings are prone to error, and doesn't matter if you isolate a particular invention or discovery or theory or law or application or instrument. Within science, it will always be prone to error, even though, for example, in scientific research, we have something called a p-value. P-value determines the probability with respect to 0.05, which is a 5% margin of error, and that has been arbitrarily agreed with scientists. Again, if someone was to step in and be like, hey, why 5%, why not 10%, why not 0.5%, why not 0.0005%, the idea again is the monopoly of whoever's in power when it comes to science. That's just the reality. And at the end of the day, once the Muslims will rise again in power before their ultimate downfall and the coming of Isa al-Islam and Mahdi al-Islam to finish off the Jews and the Antichrist who will lead them. It's extremely important that we understand every single facet of our life and understand the organization we work with, the processes involved, so on and so forth. Now, I don't mean understanding and studying deeply Lean Six Sigma or any other form of project management workflows and methodologies. All I'm saying is, wherever your calling is, wherever you're an expert in, wherever you're interested in, it could be financial services, legal theory, philosophy, medicine, engineering, linguistics, history, make sure you go into it 100%. That's an area that I personally struggled with for some time. Again, just complacency and the ease of access via AI and the internet. But as you've seen so far, studying about 10 to 15 pages of a book takes almost 2 hours to actually absorb in depth. And the beautiful thing about books before the 21st century, the grammar, the way they wrote books, despite some errors, is quite beautiful, and it certainly enhances my own vernacular and my vocabulary and understanding punctuation. Although I am still refining and polishing my English, it's extremely important that you never stop learning. And I'll end with the hadith from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is, seeking knowledge is incumbent. It's incumbent, meaning it's mandatory, it's compulsory for every Muslim man and woman. So, inshallah, next time we will be looking at some other sciences, some other theology, and dissect in the best way we can. And inshallah, I can continue offering you some value, and may Allah make things easy for us. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.